let's talk jury duty. But first, let's talk firefighters. When I say that word, firefighters, we're all thinking the same thing, right? I mean, how dumb do you have to be to go into a burning building? That thing could collapse, you could get hurt, even killed. That's what we're all thinking, right? Well, of course not. We love firefighters. I almost never hear anyone say anything bad about firefighters. Certainly not here in the West, where we depend on them so heavily to protect our life and property. Just last week in the news, we saw Australians cheering American firefighters in Sydney International Airport as they arrived to help fight the Australian wildfires. By contrast, what do I most often hear about jurors? A jury is made up of 12 people who are too stupid to get out of jury duty, right? Some of you may have thought or said something along those lines. Perhaps you are among those who have Googled how to get out of jury duty, or chucked your jury summons in the trash without ever opening it. I won't ask you to publicly identify yourselves. I think you know who you are. Why is it that we view firefighters almost universally in heroic terms on one hand, but on the other hand, it is very common for jurors to be considered, well, morons? Now, I don't think that. I hope by the end of this talk, none of you thinks that, but that is a common stereotype. Well, firefighters are heroes because they risk their own well-being to protect other people's life and property. But jurors also protect other people's life and property, not to mention their liberty. Sometimes jurors do this with a guilty verdict. None of us wants murderers, rapists, abusers, people who cheat or steal from others running amok in our society without consequence. And in these types of cases, jurors can impose those consequences with a guilty verdict. But in fact, jurors' primary role has nothing to do with punishing people. It's important to remember that jurors also protect our life, liberty, and property with their not guilty verdicts. Well, how do they do this? First, some jurors understand that the accused person is innocent. They have no doubt that this person did not commit the crime, so they vote not guilty. Second, possibly more commonly, they look at this person who is accused and we don't know one way or the other. Are they for sure guilty or not guilty? What do we do in our society when we can't determine for sure if someone has committed a crime or not? Well, we have a system that is designed intentionally to err on the side of liberty so that we don't inadvertently punish an innocent person. Each accused person in our legal system is considered innocent until and unless proven guilty beyond reasonable doubt. So that's a second reason jurors may vote not guilty. But did you know there is a third scenario in which jurors can vote not guilty? They may believe, even beyond reasonable doubt, that someone has broken the law and still find them not guilty because they believe that to punish this person would still be unjust. Jurors are empowered to temper the law with mercy, even in these cases. This is called, among other things, jury nullification. As the executive director of a national nonprofit headquartered right here in Montana, I teach people about just this concept. To be clear, most not guilty verdicts occur because either the jurors felt that the person was innocent or they weren't sure whether or not they committed a crime. Jury nullification, on the other hand, takes place when jurors decide to vote not guilty even though they believe beyond reasonable doubt that the person broke a law. Did you know that some of the amendments to the United States Constitution actually trace back to cases of jury nullification? One of those is the 13th Amendment, emancipation. Congress passed the Compromise of 1850 to address escalating tensions in the United States and its territories over the issue of slavery. And the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was key to making that work. It also suffered from widespread resistance, including among jurors, who were some of its earliest resistors. Consider the abolitionist hotbed of Syracuse, New York, in October of 1851. A man named William Henry escaped the courthouse during legal proceedings intended to return him to slavery in the South. Imagine, thousands of people lined the streets cheering him on as he made his escape, still hobbled in irons. These people blocked law enforcement who were pursuing him to help him get away. Unfortunately, he was recaptured, but that is not the end of the story. After he was recaptured, some 50 of those thousands of people stormed the courthouse themselves. They overpowered guards with clubs and axes, smashed in windows, and broke down the courtroom door to help him escape. Now, afterward, when the trials began, a mysterious epidemic broke out among jurors. People reported being unable to serve due to colds, rheumatic gout, vertigo, and deafness. And that was just the beginning of the government's trouble with these jurors. Of 26 people who were indicted, the government managed to secure only a single conviction. And then jurors turned the tables. An Onondaga County grand jury found that there was sufficient evidence to criminally charge the federal marshal who had himself arrested Henry in the first place. Now, after this time, of course, government ramped up its efforts to coerce jurors into convicting in such cases. But widespread resistance, including among jurors of good conscience, prevailed. The 13th Amendment was passed in 1865, freeing the slaves. Now, before I get to my second example, let's have a show of hands. Who here perhaps indulged in a cocktail or two over the holidays or ever? Well, those of you who have raised your hands have jurors in part to thank for that. I couldn't be more lucky to tell you that we have the pleasure today of celebrating these hero jurors 100 years to the day after the Volstead Act took effect. It outlawed the production, transportation, and sale of intoxicating liquors. That's right, 100 years ago today, the United States was a dry country, and none of us has touched a drop since, right? That's how it worked out. Well, not exactly. According to the Chicago Tribune, Prohibition took effect 1 second after midnight on January 17th, 1920. In less than an hour, the first liquor violation was documented. And that kicked off the decade we now know as the Roaring '20s, right? Well, how do jurors deal with their peaceful, harmless neighbors who have actually broken the law in these cases? Let's take one illustrative example of many I've found in this era. Consider the trial of one Mr. George Bevan, who was tried for a liquor violation. I love his jurors. They were so conscientious. They sat through the trial, listened to everything that went on, and then were taken to the jury room to deliberate. And what was given to them in the jury room? The evidence. They looked at this container of clear liquid and said, well, how do we know that's liquor? I'm looking at it, I can't tell beyond reasonable doubt what that is. What do I do? I'm a conscientious juror. Well, let me get one more. They each sampled the evidence, passing it around the jury room, each person in turn doing their experiment. Somehow, to their shock and surprise, at one point they discovered there was no evidence in the trial. They rendered the only verdict they could under such circumstances: not guilty. The 21st Amendment was passed less than 14 years after Prohibition began. I think many of you can think of modern day analogs, such as in marijuana cases, where we see many jurors resisting those. Okay, you say, jurors do good work, that's true, but firefighters, they really risk their well-being. They put themselves in danger. Jurors, they just sort of sit around in court and then go home. At the end of the day, no worse for the wear, right? Well, you might be surprised to know of the psychological toll that jury duty can take on people. Some jurors are deeply wounded by the nature of the evidence and testimony they're exposed to. In the Boston Marathon bomber trial, for example, jurors heard horrific descriptions of violence, viewed autopsy photos of mangled bodies of the victims, and listened to the testimony of a father who had to make the nightmarish choice to leave his dying 8-year-old son with his wife while he tried to save the life of his 6-year-old daughter. Other jurors fear for their safety. In the trial of drug cartel boss El Chapo, for instance, during jury selection, many people expressed concern for their own safety. In one Nevada case, a conviction was overturned after a judge cussed out, yelled at, threatened a juror, and even flung a book against the wall in anger when she said she would have trouble being fair and impartial in a case involving child sex abuse allegations. In another Nevada case, there was a lone holdout juror voting not guilty in the case of a defendant who was accused of shooting a police officer. He suddenly changed his vote to guilty after being tailed menacingly by a squad car for 7 miles all the way to court. Other jurors live for years, even decades, with anger and guilt after having been misled into a verdict that they now regret. In my experience talking to jurors, this is all too common, but I'll give you just 2 examples. Last year, the Washington Post published an editorial by Paul St. Louis, a juror who had convicted a man of drug dealing. Having had no idea at the time what penalty was at stake, he was shocked to later find out that this person, a meth addict with no prior convictions, accused of a nonviolent crime, was sentenced to 40 years in prison. 4 decades, folks. That is more punishment than many people who are convicted of murder or manslaughter receive. After the defendant was found dead in his cell less than a year into his sentence, St. Louis wrote in this editorial that he would have exercised his right to jury nullification had he known about it. There's also a wonderful TED Talk by a woman named Lindy Lou Eisenhood. Go look it up. It gets me every time. She was a juror on a capital murder trial who talks about her experience with post-traumatic stress disorder after that experience. She started the trial with one opinion about the death penalty, but when she was tasked with herself actually condemning another human being to death, she had a change of heart. Yet she still voted to sentence this man to death because she felt that the jury instructions left her no choice. In the decades after she rendered her verdict, she struggled with many questions, such as, am I a murderer? Now, I think one of the big reasons people think poorly of jurors has to do with the fact that we often disagree with their verdicts. I think it's important to remember, not only in the context of juries, but in our wider lives as well, that disagreement does not equal stupidity. I've learned in my time with the Fully Informed Jury Association that if I feel that jurors have rendered a verdict contrary to common sense, I should step back and take a look, dig a little deeper, and try to understand their thought process. Usually I will find something that explains how smart people could do something that to my first glance doesn't look that smart. Sometimes the prosecutor has done a terrible job, failed to make their case, prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And I thank jurors who hold those prosecutors to a high standard in an era of over-criminalization and over-punishment. Other times, we outside the courthouse may have seen something in the media that jurors were not privy to, or to turn that around, jurors may have seen or heard things inside the courtroom that weren't widely reported outside. And those differing perspectives can very easily explain how we might come to different conclusions without resorting to questioning anyone's intelligence. Now, I'm not saying that all jurors are heroes. What I am saying is that we need heroes in our jury boxes. They not only protect us from dangerous people in society, but they protect us from overreaching and abusive government. Let me close today by appealing to your self-interest. One day, you may be in the defendant's seat. You may be accused. Perhaps you are wrongly accused. Maybe you broke the law unknowingly. Perhaps you even broke the law on purpose, but had a good reason for doing so. Let's take a minute and think about who we would want on our jury in that case. Now, I want you to be that juror. Thank you.